Professor Wang, Professor Siu, Professor Leung, Dr. Wong, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to our book webinar jointly organized by the Government and Laws Committee HKU, GLC, and the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences in collaboration with its research cluster, Delta on the Move. I'm Anfield Tam from GLC, currently a second-year student reading Government and Laws at HKU. May I first take this opportunity to congratulate Professor Wang on his Distinguished Service Order conferred recently at the National Day Awards in Singapore. Thank you. GLC is the flagship student community of the Bachelor of Social Sciences, Government and Laws, and Bachelor of Laws program, double degree program, at the University of Hong Kong, home to the Hong Kong Journal of Law and Public Affairs and Public Jurist. GLC promote robust debates about legal and public policy issues at the nexus of international and domestic levels. GLC also works closely with the Department of Politics and Public Administration and the Faculty of Law to deliver customized mentorship schemes and academic support programs to GLAW's students. We are immensely honored to host Professor Wang Gungwu in reflecting upon his autobiographies, Home is Not Here and Home is Where We Are, in this webinar. Professor Wang is currently University Professor at the National University of Singapore and Emeritus Professor at the Australian National University. He also served as Vice Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong from 1986 to 1995. A distinguished historian of China and Southeast Asia, he has authored groundbreaking publications on the Chinese world order and the Chinese diaspora. He was conferred numerous titles and honors, including the International Academic Prize, Fukuoka Asian Cultural Prizes, and the Tang Prize in Sinology. Without further ado, may I invite Professor Helen Siu, Founding Director and Honorary Professor of HKIHSS, to comment on Professor Wang's long-standing intellectual relations with the Institute. Professor Siu is currently a Professor of Anthropology and former Chair of the Council on East Asian Studies at Yale University. Professor Siu, please.
Thank you, Enfield. Good morning, Professor Wang, and good morning, everyone. This is such an honor for Angela and I to welcome Professor Wang here to speak about his recent books, the Home series. Professor Wang needs no introduction, and our Hong Kong U community knows him well as a former Vice Chancellor and a frequent visitor. As a long-time honorary fellow of our institute, he has offered us both intellectual wisdom and practical advice on issues big and small. We would very much wish to highlight our appreciation here, very briefly. Several programmatic transformations of the Institute have to do with Professor Wang's works. First, his early writings on the Chinese diaspora focuses on multifaceted Chineseness beyond a world beyond geographic China. Second, his insistence on putting Eurasia on our analytical map, together with people I know, Jack Goody, Janet Abulagood. His insistence challenges both Eurocentric and Sinocentric mindsets. It has inspired Angela and I to make inter-Asia connections our major research agenda a decade ago, and to rethink Asia as an empirical reality as well as a conceptual category. Professor Wang and Margaret came to Hong Kong U I think in October 2018, I think Angela, if I'm right, October 2018, and graced us with his powerful summary of grand Chinese history, using the concept of maritime China South. He reorients East-West dichotomy by stressing an interactive North-South perspective in the long view. This, of course, becomes the cornerstone for the Institute's project on the Greater Bay Area today. Our Delta on the Move follows the natural and the multicultural ecologies of China through the borderless, dynamic humanscapes to reach Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and Africa. Today, we look forward to his moving reflection of an epoch of change, in particular of his own agency and of Margaret's, in a personal journey of almost a century. Together, they have navigated the turbulent multi-ethnic currents across Asia and the globe to forge an identity not based on territory, but on a bonding that is encompassing, loving, truthful, and dignified. Let me end my comments here with a quote from Professor Wang's and Margaret's book, Home is Where We Are. Does home have to be a country or a city? Or is home this house or that? We have been fortunate. We seemed always to have been home. We thank you, Professor Wang, for agreeing to share your precious experiences with us here today. On to you, Professor Wang.
Thank you very much, Helen, for that. I find it very moving because it reminds me how these two books began. It really began with Margaret. But let me also thank Anfield and his colleagues and students of Hong Kong U for inviting me to talk about this. I was pleasantly surprised because they are students of political science and on law and practical affairs. I was taken aback when they suggested that I talk about these two books about home. And indeed, these are books about home. It is something that arose because Margaret had some 20 years ago written for our children the early story of her life. And because of that, because the children loved it, they began to point to me, asking me to do the same. And I eventually gave in and did that, although I didn't know how to do it because I hadn't thought about it and had been doing other things all that time. But it came across quite powerfully to me because I realized that although I knew quite a lot about my parents because my mother told me quite a bit about her past, there were so many questions I'd never asked. And this is the same point that Margaret makes, that she had not asked questions of her mother in particular. And therefore, by the time she wanted to know, it was too late. And therefore, she thought she should put them down. It was a responsibility to put them down to help the children understand where they came from. And similarly, the same question was put to me, and I did the same. That was quite some time ago. I did that for my early childhood, which is the basis of the first volume, Home is Not Here, about what it was like to grow up in the world that I did. But as it turned out, I was persuaded when people heard about the fact that I had written that this is something I should encourage other people to do and get it published, make it at least available to others, to get others to do the same, because we've come to a time where now time is treated very differently. Fractions of time in the social media and so on take up the lives of people, and people don't really think about the past very much. And I was persuaded to do that. I give this background because why am I talking about home in this stage of my life? But I was persuaded that this was almost something that I had to do. As it turned out, these two volumes are really only about the early years of our lives. As it turned out, the first volume was about the first 19 years of my life. And the second volume, just purely by coincidence, because it ends where Margaret ends her story when we were leaving Kuala Lumpur to go to Canberra, and gave me the title of what turned out to be the title of the book, Home is Where We Are, and I'll explain that later. But what we suddenly realized when the two books were written, that I had been talking really about two homes. And in a sense, each of those homes were two worlds. And in both homes, whether it was my parents' home in the first 19 years of my life, when I was what might be called a Huaqiao, a Chinese overseas, where China was the country of origin, and Malaya was where I was brought up, and when I went to university and when I started to work. So in both books, both the idea of China and the idea of Malaya dominate us. It is actually the underlying or the background feature of what we understood, gradually understood by home. So first of all, China as a country of origin, that's normal. Millions of Chinese overseas have that experience. But for me, most of all, it was a China in my mind, because as it turned out, I was not merely an overseas Chinese. Our little family of my parents and me, and I was only a child, we were very different from other overseas Chinese in one sense. My father didn't go out to settle. He went out to teach for a brief period, she thought, just to serve the country and in the context of teaching the Huaqiao Chinese, which is what he was asked to do. And very much intending to go home, but very, very shortly afterwards. As it turned out, he never really did go home. He went home for a little while, never did go home, and that was a major departure. The other thing was that throughout that time, both my parents talked of going home. It was all almost on the table in almost every conversation we ever had, was to talk about people back in China, back in their own homes, or their parents, their family, their hometowns, and what was happening in China at the time when it was going through a period of civil wars between the Kuomintang and the communists, and the Japanese invasion from Manchuria all the way down to the opening of the major war in Shanghai. All that was part of the conversation. So at home, it was China all the time, as home. Someplace we were about to return to whenever we could, delayed by the war, stayed on, kept on being delayed, not possible to go, kept on waiting, but always a place that we will go back to. So that was one. Then, of course, during those 19 years, we did actually go home. I won't go into that now, but just to let you know. So the second part of it, Home 2, the second volume, was really about Malaya. And I would tell that later. It was really about Malaya, in which Malaya was constantly on our minds. But it was actually in the whole of the 38 years Malaya was there. Being brought up in Ipoh, in my case, in the case of Margaret, it was Penang in Singapore, and getting used to living in a country which was, in a way, nothing to do with China at that time, and getting used to it and growing up in it, in environments which were uniquely peculiar to those places that we grew up in. So let me start with the first volume now. For my father, I think uppermost in his mind, what was China was very much a heritage of Wen meaning language, and to him, Wen is the written language, the classical language, from which our speech and our vernacular and our Baihua and our Putonghua derives. And that Wen, the written classical Chinese, is the source of what China means. And everything that derives from that language, the classical literature, the classical texts of philosophy and religion and politics, statesmanship, administration, economic growth, whatever it was, all derived from these concepts which were developed out of Wen as the Chinese had it. And what made China so distinctive. That was my father's concept of China. I don't think he ever limited China to a country or just to his own family and hometown. My mother, on the other hand, was very much grounded on the reality of China being home, where family was, hometown was, when all the extended family were together or nearby or in touch. That was a source of the sense of home. The country, however, was important too, especially after the fall of the Qing dynasty, and she was born during the end of the Qing dynasty. When she grew up in the Republic, she began to develop the sense of country. I think my father also had a sense of country, but it was secondary to the fact that it was the great traditions arising from Chinese language and civilization that really meant China to him. Whereas my mother would put the emphasis upon the country being the protector of the family and all the Chinese people and the heritage, all the things that the Chinese are proud of. So the country was necessary, but it was in her mind, in her conscious mind, the country started with the Republic of China. And she was in that sense much more openly nationalistic about this country than my father was. So that was what I grew up in. It was my world at home was all about this China. But actually, for reasons which, of course, I talk about in my book, my father was also a lover of literature. And he developed a love for English literature, so much so that when he thought of my schooling when I was 5 years old, he decided to send me to an English school on the premise that he would teach me the one that would make sure that I would always be Chinese. And then he would now send me an English school because it's only temporary. Remember, he was expecting any time the opportunity would come and they would all go back to China. So he would send me to an English school to have a good start, to learn the language of a literature that he loved. He fell in love with English literature as a student at university and took English literature for his degree. And he decided that why not give this little boy a chance to learn this tool and get it done before they go back to China, when it will be much harder to learn. At least that's, I think, what's in his mind. My mother actually protested, but they sorted it out somehow. And I was sent to an English school. But the decision turned out to be quite different from what they expected because they didn't go home. So from age 5, when I started schooling in a primary school, until 1941, when the Japanese occupied Malaya, when I stopped schooling altogether. Briefly, I went to a Chinese school until my father discovered that they were going to introduce more and more Japanese language. My father decided to take me out of school and decided he would educate me himself. He would make sure that I would learn my Chinese at home. But of course, during that 3.5 years of the Japanese occupation, I did not use any English. I had no English, did not go to school, English school, did not learn English from anybody. I didn't speak English at all, but entirely Chinese. And I learned one great thing about the Japanese occupation. It gave me a chance to mix among all the various Chinese communities in Ipoh, and they were Hakka, Cantonese, Hokkien, Teochew, and others. And I began to realize how different we were because we spoke Mandarin at home. My parents coming from Jiangsu, my mother spoke nothing but a Zhenjiang Chinese. My father had at least a more general Putonghua, but neither of them mastered any of those dialects. Whereas I, as a little boy wandering around and playing with the other kids, I learned a little bit of almost all the dialects and actually turned out to be quite happy doing that. So that's my background. The two worlds were that I went to school in an English school in a Malay state with a Malay Sultan, protected by British officials and located in what the British called the British Empire at that point. So there was some kind of imperial background to that. I mean, I was not particularly concerned about it, nor was my father, because after I was born in the Dutch Empire in Surabaya, in Java, and my father himself, my mother, they were born in empires too. They were Manchu empires, the Qing empires. So the idea of empire was quite normal. So that was the background. And then we went to China. When the war ended, incidentally, that's also interesting. When the war ended, the question came up again. Now there was a chance to go to China. And my parents had to make a decision whether to go straight away or what do I do? What do they do with me? No schooling for 3.5 years, no school certificate of any kind. How could I start in China? So with my father's wisdom as a teacher and educator, he decided that he should let me finish the English school education that I started out with, finish it, get a certificate, and hope that that certificate would be recognized by a university in China to allow me to enter into the university. And of course, that was possible because my English would have been good enough, if not better than most Chinese students, and that may at least help me over the difficulties with all the things that I lacked in the Chinese education. So already I was caught in a way, neither Chinese educated enough for the modern Chinese university, and nor properly English educated because I lost 3.5 years having not gone to school. And really formally, I was barely educated in subjects other than English literature, which at least I kept on reading a bit through my father's collection. Nevertheless, I was very fortunate. I got into my father's own university, the National Central in Nanjing at the time. But the China that I got home to turned out to be very, very different from all the things that my parents had been telling me. Not their fault, they were telling me hopeful things, preparing me for China with a very positive and optimistic view of what I would do as one day as a good Chinese citizen serving this new country, especially one that had come out of the Second World War as on the side of the victors. So very hopeful time in many ways, except that we arrived when a new civil war had begun. And at the university, the students had been demonstrating and got into big trouble. The governments had clamped down. And by the time I arrived, so many of the student leaders were in jail that the students' community was very quiet and did not openly talk about politics at all. What we did observe, however, was that the civil war was going very badly for the Kuomintang government, although the newspapers said otherwise. But even then, we did not know how badly it was. We certainly did not expect the Kuomintang government, the Nanjing government, to collapse within a couple of years. Well, I enjoyed my university life very well. I got admitted. I took foreign languages. That was about the only department I think I could have qualified in. I enjoyed it all. Of course, as a first-year student, we all had to take Chinese. We all had to take Chinese history. We even had to take Simon Zhuyi to study the politics of the Kuomintang, and Sun Yat-sen's ideas and so on. All that we took very lightly. Nothing was very difficult, not too demanding, and I enjoyed every moment of it as students among my fellow students, except that at the same time, I knew that something was going wrong. Not only the war was going wrong, the economy was going wrong. The inflation was terrible. I mean, our money was not worth very much. And my father went and got a small job in a high school attached to the university, and he felt very ill. The first winter he encountered, he was not a very strong, healthy man anyway, and he felt very ill, and my mother simply decided that he would not survive another winter. It was actually that bad. So in the end, sadly, they decided they had to go back to Malaya, where it was tropical, warm, and he could live. This is my mother thinking, and made a very firm decision to leave and leave me alone, leave me to study in China, but they would go back. Not expecting that within months, that whole political scene was about to change. The collapse of the currency, the attempts to revive it, the economy completely destroyed by middle of 1948. And then the war went wrong. The communists began to win in Manchuria, getting close to Beijing, finally reaching the Huaihai, the Huai River, not far from Nanjing. And in that context, the university actually closed down. In the middle of my second year, the first semester of the second year, they decided to 解散 and send us home. At that point, while those of us who had no home to go back to in China, we just stayed on. But my parents insisted that I return to join them. And after a lot of toing and froing, I decided I had to. I was persuaded that as an only child to older parents who now seemed to have no prospect of coming back to China, I had to return. So I reluctantly left my studies and came back to Malaya. That's the end of my first volume. Behind it all, my mother, in her late years, wrote her own account of what happened in her life. And because after my father's death, she wrote it down. She said it, and this is another account, which a point which is very important for me. She said in her own thing, she said, "You are so busy, I have no time to talk to you and tell you about what I felt about all this time that we lived outside of China. I thought I'd write it all down for you." And she did that, put it aside until just before she died, she gave it to me. And I read it, I was tremendously moved, which is why I used her account in the first book, because it paralleled, and in fact, it was much more realistic, genuine, authentic picture of what actually happened. I was really, in a way, remembering what a young child, schoolboy could remember. She was actually talking about what happened as she saw it. I come to my second volume. The second volume is different in many ways. It was a new world for me because I had to come back to Ipoh not knowing what my future was going to be. I didn't want to leave the university. I enjoyed being in a university. I didn't know where I would go next. Where can I continue my studies? My father, however, who was equally anxious and wanted to make sure that I did not lose the chance to go to university, made sure that I followed what was happening in Malaya. And by coincidence, the University of Malaya was formed out of two earlier colleges built by the British in Singapore, a medical college and an arts and science college, as a kind of teacher's training college. And neither gave degrees, but eventually, on the eve of their departure, so to speak, as the whole process of the post-war decolonization and the empires are going back and leaving all these colonial states behind, they allowed this university to be set up to train the people who would take over from them, and in the hope that these people would be sympathetic to their values and the whole system that they had set up in the colonial states. My father wasn't terribly concerned about that part of it, but he was concerned that I should continue my studies. He could not afford to send me abroad. There's no question of that. So if I didn't go to university, I would have to find some other way of making a living. And he would regret that. And I would, of course, have regretted it. So I won't go into the details now. My books tell you that story. But I did go to the University of Malaya, a brand new university made out of two colleges, and then given, in a way, a kind of mission to train the people to run the country called Malaya after the British leave. And this is on the cards. The British will leave. The empire was winding down, so to speak. And the university was meant to do that. But of course, it was a university with very limited number of students, very small university. In fact, my class of art students were 60 of us in that first year entry. 40 science students, 60 art students, and then there were about 100 medical students, and that was all. But the point about it all was, this was something new. There was no country called Malaya. There were a bunch of Malay states and 3 colonies that the British had set up called the Strait Settlements of Singapore, Penang, and Malacca. And somehow in a mix after the war, in the planning after the war, they have turned all of them into one particular country called the Union, the Malayan Union, and then renamed and restructured it as the Federation of Malaya. But it was not yet independent. It had no sense of being one, in fact. It was an aspiration. What Benedict Anderson would call an imagined nation, in this case, imagined by the British, but of course supported very much by the people in these areas, waiting for the British to leave and waiting to take over from the British when that happens. So the university was to perform that job. So purely by chance, here was I leaving home as a country called China, a country in my mind, rather abstract, coming to a country that is not yet there, but is going to be there. It's a nation to be built. And we were the generation who was supposed to build that nation. At least this is how the propaganda that was put out at the time made it out to be. So that was how we started. So in a way, I left a country and found myself, with my father's help, and by the fact that I had actually lived, and this is curious, again, some curious coincidences I won't go into, but so I was qualified to apply to become a federal citizen of this yet to be country. And in that mix of things, it was a very confused period actually. So I don't know whether anybody knew what they were doing exactly, but my father thought, if you want to get to this new university and you're a citizen of China, at that time my passport was China, and China was just about to become communist, in fact on the eve of the People's Liberation Army marching into Nanjing, as it were. How could he be sure that I would be acceptable? I was a foreigner. So he enabled that because he found that I could qualify. He asked me to apply because I thought it was the only way I could get to university. I applied. I got my citizenship just a few weeks before I actually entered the university as a freshman. And that was on a week after the People's Republic of China was openly announced the 1st of October 1949. So all these momentous events were happening while I was just getting into a second gear into a new university, but starting as a freshman, starting all over again. But what did I want to study? I had nothing except this interest in English literature. And that's how I started. I wanted to go on studying English literature. I knew virtually no history to speak of, never was much interested, neither was my father. We were not particularly interested in history. The past was there. The past is not the same as history. The past hangs over all of us, but the study of history as a academic discipline was not in my father's mind nor mine when we started. We started in literature. But the question of nation building was very much alive among all the students. My fellow students, unlike the fellow students in China, who in a very depressed state of looking not forward to a great moment, but looking forward to a disastrous end to the Kuomintang government and willing themselves to welcome the new liberation armies marching into Nanjing and Shanghai. That was a very, I would say, difficult moment for my fellow students in China. But in Singapore, and almost all the students came from Malaya, all these students from Malaya were in the opposite kind of exuberance about this possibility of a new nation being left in the hands of our generation, so to speak. A very exciting moment. So I must confess, I was caught up in it. This was something positive. And it was not something totally unknown to me because, remember, I started with two worlds. One world was this China that my parents had given me. The other world was what my school gave me, an English school, a colonial school that taught in English, didn't teach much. There was not a great deal of substance in what I learned, but they taught me enough of the language and the mathematics and so on, enough to get around. And then, of course, I lost it for 3.5 years. When I came to get the certificate, it was really a rushed affair in which I would say I managed to get the certificate without being educated. There's just not enough time to be educated. So my education was extremely patchy, but whatever it was, it belonged to these two worlds. The Wen of my father, the classical Chinese that he got me to learn, and this mastery of basic English to be able to use it as an efficient tool for learning other things. And by the time I realized that I really wasn't set to be a literature scholar, And the idea of writing literary criticism or being a scholar of English literature didn't really appeal to me. I was interested in the creative side, and I tried that. But in the end, it didn't really fit my skills or temperament. I wasn't inclined that way. What drew my attention was the exciting nation-building politics, the need to know the history of what was behind all this. What was the empire that was there, that from which we are now building new nations? What kind of nation are we going to build out of the kind of empire that the British led? We looked around. There were other empires leaving behind other kinds of states, and they were very, very different from us. I mean, the Philippines come out of the Spanish and American background, totally different. Indonesia taking over the whole of the Dutch Empire, becoming one enormous nation, something they never were before. And this is incredibly exciting for our neighbors in Indonesia. And above us, there was Myanmar, which absolutely rejected the British completely, and the Vietnamese, who were fighting the French, already fighting bitterly against the French. And then there were Cambodians and that. So we looked around, and my goodness, this is an extraordinary moment in time for this region. There were no nations to speak of. Maybe Thailand, kind of monarchical, they could claim to be some kind of nation, but it was not yet to be. They too have their nation building problems. So all of us found ourselves, all these miscellaneous peoples who were never one political unit, didn't even share the same language or culture or religion or anything at all, to speak frankly, except having been colonies of Western empires for a long time. So empire and nation became the dominant feature of our daily lives as students when we were preparing ourselves, as it were, to be responsible citizens once a nation one day came about. So my first 6 years living in a hostel, 5 years in a hostel, was primarily among students for whom this was a major concern. With me, however, deciding that I really didn't want to be a scholar, be a civil servant or a school teacher. I loved the idea of a university. I enjoyed university life so much, the opportunity to learn things in such a free way, and I really appreciated it. That was the kind of life that I would love to have. And then came the most dramatic moment in my life, I put it that way. I met Margaret. Now, I met Margaret in a literature class. She was a student of literature. She was always fond of literature. To her, literature was really wonderful. And we met. She was a year junior to me, but we met in the class, and we found we had much in common. But what was remarkable was while we found much in common and got to know each other, the more we knew each other, the more we realized we were uniquely outsiders in this new sphere. Everybody was an outsider to some extent. When this new nation was yet to be, there was nothing there was clear cut, with little miscellaneous structures, all trying to renegotiate something that would make themselves come together as a nation. And there we were, both of us, in my case, born in Southeast Asia, but somewhere else in the Dutch territory, brought up in a Malay state, not a British colony, incidentally, a Malay state, looking to China as home, and then being forced to return to this Malay state, about to become a new nation called Malaya, and really not belonging to any of those Chinese communities out there. The vast majority of them were either Hokkien, Hakka, Teochew, Cantonese, and they all had their own organizations, own networks, own associations and so on. Whereas we as people, my parents and I, as people from Jiangsu speaking Mandarin, and my mother and father never learned any of those dialects. And this is how separate they were in a way, that their obsession with China back in their country of origin kept them apart from the people below. I was really an outsider, not just among the indigenous and local people. I was outsider even among the Chinese community. I didn't belong to any of those major organizations and networks that were predominant among the Huaqiao. I found that Margaret was even more so. She was born in Shanghai. Her father as I discovered, was actually a Taiwanese who was born in Keelung in northeastern Taiwan, but studied in Xiamen, in Guilangyu, and then went on to Yenjing University and became Chinese in that way. Whereas her mother came from an obscure town in northwestern Fujian and not related to any of the other Hokkiens in Southeast Asia. In fact, till this day, I have never met another family from the town called Shaowu, which is on the way to Jiangxi in northwestern Fujian. So I didn't know all these things, of course, when I met Margaret, but eventually, as we go to know each other, the more we found that we not only had common interests in literature, we all not only got fond of each other as human beings, fond of literature, fond of music, shared a lot in common, but in the end, we found ourselves both on the edge of all the communities and societies. In her case, even more unique for me because in her case, her family broke up. Father and mother were separated. Father returned to Taiwan. Mother remained, and an extraordinary woman. There are two women in the world I admire tremendously, my own mother and Margaret's mother. In her case, a woman who brought up 5 children on her own as a teacher and did that. And coming from this place called Shawu. And as we realized why we were, in a strange way, equally excited by the idea that we can now be part of a new adventure to build a new nation called Malaya. This Malaya was new to everybody, but for us, we were on the margins of everything anyway. To be, all of us being on the margins of a yet-to-be country was extraordinarily unusual and something that we really learned to appreciate. So meeting Margaret not only meant that we became attached to one another, we found that we really wanted the same thing. We wanted to see this country called Malaya succeed. Well, as it turned out, to cut the story short, we studied. He supported me in my move to history, to be a scholar, to learn. And as it turned out, when I turned to history, I turned to Chinese history quite naturally because that was really interesting. I wasn't interested in British history. I certainly wasn't interested in British imperial history, whereas I was very curious about the Chinese in Southeast Asia, so many of them, their history, the fact that people like Kang Youwei and Sun Yat-sen spent years among these Huaqiao in Southeast Asia and influenced their way of thinking and influenced the way, in fact, the Nanyang Huaqiao developed and became patriotic Huaqiao, the Aigo Huaqiao that so dominated the story by my lifetime. So that kind of interest drew me to history of this part of the world. And when it turned out that I could not do modern history because by that time, the anti-communist policies of the governments of Malaya and the British behind it, and the fact that the Cold War had been extended to this part of the world meant that anything to do with China, to modern and contemporary China, was suspect. We could be communist agents, fifth column for the Chinese Communist Party, spying for China, or being very nationalistic and supporting the Kuomintang, who were also sending agents to Southeast Asia to influence the Chinese people, and carrying out, as it were, a kind of civil war, political civil war between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party among the Huaqiao in Southeast Asia. That was a fierce thing going on throughout the 1950s and 60s. So in that context, the fact that my father had stayed away from all this and not being active in it had in fact passed on to me a certain hesitancy about joining in things which are of no direct concern to us. And the excitement of building Malaya actually freed us from being locked into any particular Chinese political dilemmas, which most of the overseas Chinese were faced with. So in a way, it gave us certain freedom from that kind of politics into a new venture, a new initiative that excited a whole new generation. All of us prepared to give up a lot of our lives to make sure that this new nation could succeed one day. And in that context, I turned to history. And because I couldn't do modern and contemporary Chinese history, I turned to ancient history. That's a long history by itself. And that's eventually how I turned to sinology when I went to London to do my PhD. By the time I came back in 1957, coincidentally, on my way back on our ship back to Singapore, the Federation of Malaya became independent. The country was now legitimate. We as Malayan citizens were now recognized internationally. This was a country, but it was still very much a new early stages. The country was only starting to build a nation. Many, many people were very fearful of what would be the outcome because there were different ethnic groups, different kinds of interests, and many of the people in the country were involved in the politics outside. The Malays involved in Indonesian politics, Indians in Indian politics, the Chinese, of course, interested in both mainland and Taiwan politics. So in that sort of context, what are the chances of building a peaceful and harmonious new nation out of this Malaya? It was really a challenge. So I saw that, however, both, and this is interesting, Margaret, who lived came from China to Penang and Singapore, had only lived in British colonies, never had anything to do with the Malay states. Whereas actually I grew up in the Malay states, so I had a feeling and a certain affection for the nature of Malay society. But when it came to it, when he came back to teach, and I asked to teach in the University of Malaya division in Kuala Lumpur, when that was set up, so that we could move and work in Kuala Lumpur, in the heart of the country, of this new country called the Federation of Malaya. Margaret was only too happy to join me. She was delighted. This was leaving Singapore to come with me to Kuala Lumpur was part of the same, in a way, vision of our link with this new country. Then she joined me. She became a Malayan citizen. She started as a Malay. She prepared herself to eventually become someone in the Malayan Teachers College to educate the new generation of students, particularly in the English language as a working language for official business and legal business. And we were prepared. We committed our lives to the University of Malaya, and I taught Chinese history, and I continued to work on Chinese history, pre-modern. I taught, in fact, pre-modern, at least in Chinese terms, and not 近代史, but 古代史. I was 1500 to 1800, which in the West they call it pre-modern, but in China, if you take out what the Opium War was the beginning of 近代史, anything before the Opium War was 古代史, then I was still continuing to teach 古代史 in University of Malaya. Again, coincidentally, all that time, what was happening to the Chinese in Southeast Asia was uppermost in the minds of all the governments, not only in Southeast Asia, but in the United States, in China, and for that matter, other members of the active members in the Cold War, that this was a political kind of linkage with the communist world through the Chinese, which had to be watched and treated with great care and caution. And of course, within Malaya itself, there was the emergency. The Malayan Communist Party was fighting a desperate war, which the British called terrorism, using the word in the early use of the phrase to call them terrorism. And it was a very bitter war. And although I was a federal citizen by 1949, I was perfectly aware that this was the situation there. It was very clear, every Chinese was suspect. And if we showed any interest in contemporary China, we were even more suspect. And so I had learned, as I had learned in Nanjing itself, among my fellow Chinese students, how to keep your head down when the whole government is out there looking out for dangerous subversives among the students. In Malaya, it was in a way the same. The special branch was keeping an eye on us. Many of my own classmates in the University of Malaya went to jail and were detained for anti-British activities of one kind or the other. So it was a time of great tension. So it's a mixture, excitement, tension. Ultimately, the hope was, out of all this, the British will leave one day, the country will be independent, and we'll have a chance to build a nation that we could call our home because we had participated in and helped to build it up. We, as it were part of the work in progress as we saw it at the time. Margaret shared it with me. And because she was willing to make that commitment, our partnership was more than just an ordinary marriage of husband and wife. She was equally committed to the picture of our future in this home associated with the country. Let me now bring it all together, because this is just our lives, and my books, 2 books, tell that story. What to make of all of this? And it's quite clear that when the time came, I was still committed to wanting to be a scholar, a teacher, because working in a university, teaching at that level, doing research was the most wonderful thing I could imagine doing for the rest of my life. And Margaret supported me in that. And this became, as it were, the focus of a new kind of home, not a home that is tied to a country, but a home that could tie to an environment in which there was a freedom to learn. I began to be enamored of that. I was actually completely lost in that, enjoying those opportunities to learn and to teach, while being, of course, very cautious about what I was teaching, because I was perfectly aware that all of us, particularly those of Chinese descent like me, or whatever we were teaching, were being carefully scrutinized, and whether among my fellow colleagues or students, they were out there making sure that I wouldn't do anything wrong. That was a sense. I was aware of that, and I accepted that. That was part and parcel of this painful process of nation building in the middle of a Cold War, in the middle of ideological bitterness on both sides, totally irreconcilable, and willing to turn to violence and so on. It was not at all a pleasant or easy environment to live in. All that I totally accepted. This was part and parcel of what was given. And it was in the context of what was given that we could do what we could do, whatever we could do to make this country work. And I was prepared to do that. But in my little frame of Chinese history, ancient Chinese history, taught in the University of Malaya, all that time, as it turned out, my work on Chinese history came to be recognized. I became better known for my work on Chinese history. At the same time, my commitment to Malaya, the years I spent trying to define what is new Malaya and new Malaysia that it was turning to be. You see, even the borders of the country were indeterminate. We were still in the middle of shaping what this country was going to look like. When the British were leaving behind Sabah and Sarawak and making sure Singapore would join in the rest of the Federation in Malaya to be a larger country called Malaysia. The complicated issues are, we don't need to trouble you here, but to bear in mind that this was a period of, you might say, great changes, all internal changes, and much tension, including ethnic tensions between the Malays and the Chinese, including ideological tensions among the Chinese themselves, between those who were not communists and those who were very sympathetic with New China, with PRC China. So all this was happening at the same time. So I not only became known as a scholar of Chinese history, it became expected of me that I would know what was happening to China. And indeed, what was happening in China was extraordinary. I mean, while all this was happening, there was a great leap forward after the 100 flowers blooming, great leap forward, and then eventually the Cultural Revolution. I was expected to know what was happening. That was impossible. I couldn't know, I didn't know, because in the anti-communist policies of the time, anything to do with these subjects, these books were banned, were not available. None of their sources were available to any of us. And we had to make do reading bits and pieces here and there, but really not able to explain or to understand it. That's one side. On the other side, I was increasingly drawn to the history of the overseas Chinese. I was interested from very early on, but I got into Chinese history. But now I was really drawn much more so, because if I was going to identify with a country called Malaya, the Chinese in Malaya and their future, their political future in particular, what where will that come from? It has to rest on its history, what the Chinese contributed to the development of the country, how it related to all the people, how well they fitted in for a long time until the problems came with British intervention in Malaya, the Malay states and the Chinese governments, and the British and the Chinese conflicts and so on. All this added to the complexities in that relationship. So the study of the overseas Chinese became more and more intense, of intense interest to more and more people. And I began to take that very seriously. And I said, this is my contribution to this formation of a new Malayan state, to help to understand the role of the Chinese, the history of the Chinese contributions to the making of this country, and to be able to make the Chinese also understand their future role in the country to be. So all these are part and parcel of the kinds of things that are going through my mind. That by contributing to Malayan history, I was also contributing to an understanding of all the Chinese in Southeast Asia. And that subject itself was being studied by more and more people. So I was engaged in that as well. So while all that was happening, this subject became enormous. And I had to, in a way, make a choice. I knew for one thing, I could not directly contribute to Malayan history to my satisfaction. I did not understand enough of the roots of Malay society, the Malay Sultanate, the Malay states as such, those riverine states that had developed over centuries, and how they evolved among themselves into the kind of Islamic states that eventually became Indonesia Raya, Malaysia Raya, the large territories involving the Malay peoples. I didn't really belong to that. I knew I could not make a contribution there that would be of any great significance compared to what other people could. I could make a contribution to the study of the Chinese. But in comparison, what I was also at the time being recognized was that I knew enough Chinese history to be expected to understand what was the role of relationship in the Chinese past and the Chinese present. How, for example, do you explain what happened after the Great Leap Forward, the socialist movement, and down to the Cultural Revolution? And when that happened, I was drawn into a lot of other conferences, meetings, and so on. In the midst of the Cold War, of course, it was an unavoidably political subject. I was not interested so much in the politics of it. I was particularly concerned to understand how could Chinese civilization, that heritage of 3,000 years, end up with Mao Zedong's attack on the whole of Chinese tradition to build on this Cultural Revolution, which ultimately want to eliminate all signs of the hereditary values that the Chinese were so proud of. How could that be explained? I was myself so intrigued by that very question that I really was tremendously tempted to learn more about it. It was in that context when I was very much involved in university administration, teaching, and really overstretching myself. I was conscious of the fact that I wasn't doing enough research. I was not learning enough, trying to teach and to get things done while not learning enough to make myself clear and credible in trying to explain what was happening was something that left me with great dissatisfaction. I was totally unsatisfied in the way my life was going. So it so happened, coincidentally, I was offered jobs abroad. And funnily enough, all jobs that I was offered was in China, on the study of China. Not on the study of Malaysia or Southeast Asia, but on the study of China. And the opportunity to get back to research was, frankly, irresistible. Margaret was perfectly aware how I was getting very frustrated at my lack of research and the fact that I was not learning enough to satisfy myself, and realized how deeply I was concerned about my own academic future as a scholar. So when these offers came, she seriously considered them. We discussed it because it involved her. She was committed to Malaya just as much as I was. She had learned her Malay, prepared herself for a career in Malayan Teachers College. And we had in fact made our decision to build a new home. We built a new house. We had 3 children who were just about to go to school. 2 of them were already in school, in primary school, learning the national language, preparing themselves to grow up in this new country called Malaya. But the fact that I was not able to do what I believe I had to do to remain a scholar troubled her almost as much as it troubled me. So when the offers came, she shared my concern. Maybe we should take up one of those offers, go away for a few years, do your research, and then come back. And on that basis, we made the decision to leave for my job in the University of Malaya. I didn't want to leave, but it was just it was necessary to do this work satisfactorily. I had to actually leave it to somebody else, have my research, and take my chances and come back later on. I was prepared to do that. Margaret was prepared to do that. And that decision that we made together, and that decision which in fact had greater implications for her career than for mine. It was actually for my career, and was a great sacrifice to her career to make that decision with me that really turned the story around about this question of home. If home is Malaya, the country, if not China, now it's Malaya. If home is a country, if home is this particular university campus that I enjoyed so many years of work in, then why are we going away? Why are we going to do something else? And all that thinking led us, well, we made the decision, we did leave, but it led us to that final conclusion when at the time when we left our house to get ready to go to Canberra, and Margaret turned around to say, not to worry, home is where we are. And that was the conclusion part of it. What else could I draw from it? What else can I draw from it? I want to draw 3 things from it. Home is where we are is, of course, that was obvious. I had lived a life in which there had been very few choices I could make. Most of the choices were made for me. Most of the choices were limited choices. The best choice I could get, I could do. And in the end, the only choice that was totally free was that choice to marry Margaret, and Margaret's choice to take me as her partner. That was the one choice that both of us made freely. In making all those choices, we were surrounded by larger political concepts like empire and nation, ending empires and starting nations. And it was a much, much more painful and difficult process than anyone expected, certainly than I expected. And Margaret and I felt the complexities, and ultimately it was work in progress and was going to go on. It's still going on, to be quite frank. But in the middle of all that, there was one great discovery that both of us made, that no matter what things were like, choice or no choice, you make the most of it, and you look out for, you seek the little freedoms that you can get, because freedom is never absolute. You can never have enough of it, and it never can be some kind of ideal that you must reach that ideal freedom or not, either that or nothing. That's simply not practical and not something that we experience. And it is not, we don't see it as necessarily a universal thing. It could be, but not necessarily. What was important was, if you can get something, if you can get some freedoms, take it. Take whatever freedom you can get, look out for it, find your freedoms, make the most of it. And if you make the most of the freedoms that you can find, you can make a life that can be quite satisfactory. And in that context, then indeed, the conclusion must be, home is wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for your insightful sharing. The following session will be open question and answer, moderated by Dr. John Wong, convener of the Delta on the Move Research Cluster of HKIHSS. As reminded previously, if you have any questions for Professor Wang, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom. We will then read them out during the session so that Professor Wang can answer them. So Dr. Wang, please.
Sure. Thank you, Enfield. We have quite a few questions on identities. Let's start with that, if we may. Let me just choose this one for its representative line of question. Jean-Pierre Capiston asked, well, would like to thank you, Professor Wang, for the talk you give in Hong Kong, to us in Hong Kong at this particular juncture. His question is this: we all have multiple identities, our true children even more so as globalization is getting more profound. But how can we reconcile this reality with growing nationalism, particularly in China, where only one identity seems to be accepted and acceptable? In other words, is there still some space for multiple identities and even for different ways of being Chinese?
That's a very good question and a very difficult one. Obviously, it depends on where you are. If you are in China today, you may be under tremendous pressure from your fellow citizens, by the Chinese government, by the Chinese Communist Party, and by your neighbors and so on, to be nationalistic in that context. The pressure to be nationalistic, I think, is going very strong. And this is part and parcel of the development that I experienced when I was young. The idea that empires become nations. I could go into that because it's a very big subject. But what underlines that is the idea that in the 19th century, a new kind of empire had developed, never known before. Before that, empires were empires of monarchs, all kinds of warriors and fighting among themselves, and whoever won territorial expansion, and including all kinds of peoples in empires. And they were monarchic, they were feudal, some of them had religious backgrounds, and so on. But there had never been something called a national empire. The national empire was an invention starting from the 18th century. I would say that the people involved were people like the independence of the Dutch from the Spanish Empire. That was the first nation that came out of an empire. But it was not really fully understood because it was a context of formation of sovereign states under the Treaty of Westphalia. And it's often seen that way, that nations emerged from the Treaty of Westphalia. But what was important was, from the emergence of nations, what had been previously feudal empires or commercial empires like those of the Dutch and the British and the French before, now became national empires. They are seen as the empires of the French people. The French citizenry, the whole French nation were in charge of that. Similarly with the British, and of course the Dutch had that already. And that was expanded, attracted the Italians when the Italians became one country in the 19th century, and the Germans when they got united under Bismarck. They began to also think in terms of national empires. And finally, in Asia, the Japanese were converted by the same idea, that you have a national empire in which the nation extends its territory over vast areas as a nation. And therefore, you get to develop the idea that empires come to an end when you had empires ended after the Second World War because they fought each other to a standstill. All these empires have to go home to their own nation states. French went back to France, British went back to England, and so on. And the idea then, what they are succeeded by are all to be nations, nation states. And the post-1945 world order under the United Nations was a world of united nations. All nation states qualify. Now, up to that point, China did not fit into this concept of empire or nation because China was never a national empire. It was the Manchu Empire. A bunch of Manchus conquered China. Before that, there were Mongols, there were others. But the relationship between the Manchus and the Mongols and the Chinese were historically rooted in many encounters in the past. And in the end, it was possible for a Manchu to become a Chinese, for a Mongol to decide whether or not to be a Chinese. All these things were left in the open, and over the centuries, extremely vague. There was no territorial understanding. There was no idea of sovereignty. None of these things existed. But the Republic of China under Sun Yat-sen brought in the concept of nationhood, of nationality. And even then, immediately, he found that it was a very tricky one, because if he pursued that, then Manchuria was not part of China. Mongolia was not part of China. Tibet, Xinjiang, all these places were not part of China. China would only be Han, where the Han people were the clear majorities. And that Sun Yat-sen hesitated. And you remember they began to adopt the Manchu term and adapted it to Wu Zu Gong He, the five people's republic, including all of them. And all of them are Chinese in a vague sort of way. And they got recognized when the Qing passed on its mandate to Yuan Shikai as president of the republic. The Qing Empire became the Republic of China under Yuan Shikai. And it was internationally recognized, more or less, as a legitimate process. Now, on that basis, they began a new nationalism, which included all the territories once held by the Qing Empire. And this is why they have problems today. They have problems today because at that point, Sun Yat-sen's Minzu Zuyi suddenly became very difficult to define. They found themselves unable to call it Han Minzu. They had to call it Zhonghua Minzu. They had to invent a term to cover this area of, finally determined by the Chinese Communist Party to be 55 nations or 55 nationalities, using the phrase that the Soviet Union had created. Now, this has led to tremendous confusion all around, and led to the tremendous difficulty that China now faces today, because everybody's asking the question, what is China? This including scholars in China themselves. And because they ask this very difficult question, I think the regime finds it very necessary to encourage the people to feel nationalistic about the territory that they inherited from the Manchus in 1911 and 1912, that includes the defined territory today. Can be modified a little bit on the edges, but the whole area must be included. That means Tibetans, Uyghurs, or Turk, Xinjiang people, Mongol people, and Manchu people, all of them are part of a Zhonghua Minzu that is yet to be defined. Now you can see that this painful process has made this nationalism to something that is quite new, quite uncontrollable, and extremely difficult for even the leaders in Beijing to define in such a way that everybody understands and accepts it. And I have a feeling that this is going to be an ongoing process for a long time more.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of follow-up questions on this issue of identity and overseas Chinese. Let's start with Professor Chen Zhiwu of our colleague here at the University of Hong Kong, who asked, from your interactions and research, what are the most serious misunderstandings by mainland Chinese about overseas Chinese? Where does the big gap lie between the two sides?
The misunderstanding, you can call it that, I suppose, really began at the end of the 19th century under conditions which are very, very different from today. It began when the Manchus themselves found it extremely curious that they were not protecting the Chinese, who were millions of them living in Southeast Asia. And that the British and the Dutch could claim that those who were born in British territories or Dutch territories were British subjects and not imperial subjects. Now, when that conflict arose, the Qing dynasty found itself almost, you might say, obliged to take on the responsibility of protecting people who came from China. And that is the beginning. There's a misunderstanding on the concept of nationality. Already, the British had a concept of nationality and national empires. So if you're born in the Straits Settlements in Singapore, for example, in a colony, the British say you're born as a British subject. And similarly with the Dutch, they did the same. Now, in that sense, the British have claimed them as their subjects. And the Qing, at that point, no Chinese emperor cared two hoots about where these people had gone to. And they suddenly realized that when they were negotiating the treaties, these so-called unequal treaties in Beijing and so on, they found that while the West was defining very clearly what were the rights of their citizens, the Qing wasn't able to do that for their citizens. So they had to redefine it and find ways and means of doing so. So gradually emerged the term Huaqiao. It didn't exist before. It was a brand new term, more or less worked out by the end of the 19th century to cover every Chinese born of a Chinese father outside of China was a Chinese citizen by definition. There was no law saying that. It was just simply a definition. It was made into a law finally in 1909. I call it you can call it a kind of misunderstanding because this was the kind of recognition was based on the idea of nationality. Whereas the Qing, when they called them Huaqiao, did not have any concept of nationality. It's simply that you are subjects of the Qing emperor and that the Qing is obliged, the emperor is obliged to protect you, and then started to create consul generals and so on, sent out to Singapore, San Francisco, and elsewhere to protect those citizens or the subjects of the Qing emperor. Of course, the Huaqiao were delighted because up to that point, they were unprotected. They in fact had to accept whatever was happening wherever they went to. They had no choice. They simply had to adapt themselves to the circumstances. In the middle of all that, this Huaqiao became an active component of the revolutionary forces under Sun Yat-sen and his followers. And when they won after the Republic, that process was taken up in the Republic of China, and they were defined now in Western terms, that all these Huaqiao are citizens, nationals of the Republic of China. They would have Chinese passports, they're recognized by China, and the Qing definition that was created by the Treaty Declaration in 1909 of Citizenship Law in 1909 confirmed that, which the Republicans used. And after that, this Nanyang Huaqiao were taken to mean all Nanyang Huaqiao were patriotic, that they're all the same, they were equally loyal to China, bullied by foreigners, treated badly by foreigners, and the Chinese government must protect them from foreigners. And they made no distinction. If you say you are Chinese, your father is a Chinese, that's automatic. And that understanding, which is called what they call Jewish, I've forgotten the term now, sanguinis, by blood, you're descended by blood, that becomes a basis. The idea that all Chinese are the same came out of that. All Nanyang Huaqiao are Aigo Huaqiao, and Aigo Huaqiao all the same. And therefore, the country must protect them. If they're Aigo, how can a Go not I them? So the Go must love them as they love China. And this is a reciprocity which the Chinese government must accept as a responsibility. Now, on that basis, you can say it is a misunderstanding, because this is not based on the people loving China or loving the Chinese government and the Chinese government loving the Chinese people. It was nothing like that on the ground. It was really a kind of device whereby people could travel, people could do business, people would have advantages one way or the other. And it was a very practical device that everybody around the world used in any case. But that was the beginning of this misunderstanding. I remember growing up to being told that all Nanyang Huaqiao are alike. But it was very clear, obvious within just easily looking around. You found that the Chinese who grew up, settled there many generations in Thailand, and those in the Philippines, totally different. They're not at all like one another. They didn't even talk to each other. They couldn't understand each other. They were using different languages. And those who brought up in Dutch Indonesia or Dutch East Indies and became Indonesian, were again totally different from those in the Philippines and in Thailand. And those in Myanmar, those in Vietnam, all of them were different. And it was not so difficult to understand. It's very obvious, actually. We all knew that by instinct. So to say that Nanyang Huaqiao are all the same is a misunderstanding. It is true that in every one of these territories, the relatively newcomers to these territories who come directly from China, first or second generation, that they had their attachments to their home country or to their hometowns and to their families in China. They had that attachment was genuine, but they're only a small proportion of the total number of Chinese in Southeast Asia. That gives you an example of how easy to misunderstand. that the gradations of these different Chinese, different sense of identity, different, in fact, commitments, different loyalties. Those who are totally loyal, totally committed to the countries of their adoption are plentiful. In fact, today I would say the vast majority in Southeast Asia are actually loyal to their own countries.
Great. We have a question from Chong Wing Kit, who actually would like to think more about the contemporary situation on the same topic. His question is this: your life experience of finding new identity in Malaya occurred in the midst of open nation building that gave space for external forces and energy to find a place to live and build a future. But today, as many nation states are fragmenting, people are less satisfied with macro nation building and their futures in a nation. Many now are drawn to a more micro construction in retreating to ethnic or religious identities which pre-existed before the modern nation state. How can those who strive for a more unifying and cosmopolitan outlook live and work in such context to work for a greater good of a country, but avoid narrow nationalist ideologies that weaponize ethnic chauvinism or religious fundamentalism?
This comes back to my point about nation building being work in progress. I was referring to the new nations because they weren't nations in the past. So of course it was clearly work in progress. But what has been described early on by your questioner, and I think he's absolutely right, nation building in every nation is being challenged today. And this is because of globalization. Globalization has created a new kind of pressure on nations, which the nations of the past, of the 19th century, created in Europe, that never faced before, never thought of before. When you think of those new nations created out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or out of the Soviet end of the Soviet Union, they're just begin. They're themselves also nation building. So the Europeans are no better off in that sense, and they're based on very narrow definitions of what a nation is. Same language, same religion, same shared history. That's a kind of narrow definition, most narrow one. But globalization has now enabled people to move very freely. Modern science and communication has really opened up the world to all sorts of differences and so on. All these ethnic groups that were there before, willing to accept narrow definitions of nationhood, now say, well, they have their own identities because they can link up with their similar ethnic groups somewhere else, sub-ethnic groups somewhere else, through the communication facilities and technologies now available. So we're now open into the new challenges, which actually make the question of nation building open to, I would say, being called work in progress again. Work in progress now, not towards becoming a nation, to work in progress to ensure that what was a nation doesn't break up. So these are just as difficult questions. Who expected that there would be such a big battle over Catalonia in Spain or over the question of Scotland in Britain? All these things, I think very few people anticipated in the 19th century would not have occurred to people. People thought the British were a nation, the Spanish were a nation, and so on. And yet, in my own lifetime, when I saw how the Basques fought for their independence in Spain, how bitterly they fought, how many people were actually killed in the process of doing that. Catalan, of course, is even more obvious and still going on today. And as for Asia, we haven't even begun in some of these countries. They haven't started to make their nation. They're still in the middle of building it. And already the whole world is now being challenged by new definitions of ethnicity and identities, which now leave the question of nation building in Asia even more open and more difficult than ever before. So I would say the whole subject of nation coming out of empires is being totally re-examined and will have to be reshaped in order to make something peaceful and harmonious out of them in the future.
Thank you. We have a question that is a little bit more conceptual from Shirley Chan, who asked, have you thought of being home, quote unquote, or not, could be a temporal idea rather than just a spatial one, perhaps as a device to integrate different times, such as to bring together and make sense of the changing rhythms in the life of oneself, one's family, one's career, a nation, or an empire. If these times keep changing or clashing, should we still continue to expect that home remain one and the same?
Well, I hate to say so, but in my own lifetime, I've just done just that. I mean, I made no secret of it. Those 2 volumes just describe the first 38 years of my life, but I'm now 90 years old, so there's another 60 years after that. I have to say I have been very mobile. I have followed my own career, depending on the kind of work that I do. And when I'm asked to do things which I believe I can do and I feel I ought to do, I have moved without hesitation, because this is how it is be. And you can say this is because all that time things are changing. It is, you have actually choices to make now. It is possible to make choices. I said the first half of my life, I had very few choices. Most of the things were set for me. I had no choice and just have to make the most of what I was given. But since then, once you reach a certain point and understood, as I understood with Margaret, that home is where we are, that actually freed me. It actually liberated me from the sense that home has to be a country, a house, or an identified place. And you might say, as your questioner asked, become more temporal and not spatial. Because that freedom to actually choose to be where you think you can be most useful or be most welcome, and where you can enjoy the freedoms that you expect out of life. When you can enjoy those freedoms there better than somewhere else, you make a choice. And you can actually make some choices. Not all the time. Some people are more fortunate than others, I have to say. I have been extremely fortunate. Both Margaret and I had a very, very good set of choices that we could make. We made them, most of them, I think, without any regrets whatsoever. And those choices were definitely temporal and not spatial.
We have a couple of questions about education and more of a cosmopolitan setting. As Poon asked about your early interest in English literature, Dr. Chong Wu Leng from University of Malaya asked about Chinese medium of instructions. Perhaps I can try to synthesize it a little bit as this following question. You can see that linguistic vibrancy is quite obvious in your account of your experience, even though you seldom use any non-English words in the home series. As you explained, your father's notion of Wen was one written in Chinese, classical Chinese, but the audio scene that you depicted in the books, that was quite a different story, especially Home Is Not Here. One can hear the symphony of English, Malay, Mandarin, Cantonese, Hokkien, and other Chinese languages. Your story did make me pause and consider the situation in cosmopolitan Hong Kong and Singapore, where language variation seems a little bit too harmonized or even muffled. Obviously, your own experience stemmed from your own impressive language capacity and your parents' foresight of the evolving cultural and linguistic scene. What advice would you offer to young people, especially those of Chinese heritage, or young parents living in global hubs?
I'm reminded of the fact that when I was at Hong Kong U, we had a big debate about teaching in English or teaching in Chinese. At that point, actually, Chinese University had started to teach in Chinese, in Cantonese to be quite exact. Some of my colleagues and students raised the question of whether to use Chinese in class in Hong Kong U. And I was open, but I was simply pointed out the reality was that if we taught in Cantonese, it would be limited to Hong Kong. And a lot of things cannot be done beyond Hong Kong. Even when you're choosing your staff or students, you're limited by the Cantonese that you use to teach. And if you use Mandarin, you have certain considerations will follow. The fact that Hong Kong was operating in an international, global kind of environment, the use of English was already established. The one thing that makes Hong Kong U and the universities in Hong Kong different from those in China and become useful to those in China was the fact that you could teach in English. And you know, the extraordinary thing was when I was Vice Chancellor, I had several trips to China. I asked the Chinese many, many times, do you expect the universities to teach in Chinese? They didn't. They were quite content to say, go on doing that because you are actually doing something that we can't do in China. And you can be more useful to us. And in a different sort of way, when you look at the quality of the students who went to some of the best universities in China, They were extraordinarily brilliant students. They were drawn from a reservoir of talent so much bigger than Hong Kong. If we all taught in, say, the Chinese views in China, we can't compete. We do not have any advantage over the students in China. So I was able to talk to the Students' Union at that time, completely supported us on this. Simply that the fact that you have your capacity to do it in English and you have enough knowledge, you keep up your knowledge of Chinese, you can do that in English, gave you at least that little advantage over those very brilliant students in China when it comes to the world of knowledge and the world of the competitive technologies and methodologies. And so I thought, actually, the students have completely accepted that. There was no pressure. I was open, but there was no pressure on the university to switch to Chinese. And the students, even when some of them were struggling in English, were prepared to do it then that way to keep up and make it possible for them to improve their English that way, than to give it up altogether. And I thought that was extraordinary. So that's a very rational decision made even at the time. And I think this is even more true today. I mean, I personally, frankly, I have nothing against Cantonese. I'm very fond of the language. I loved it. But the fact is that if you're going to switch to Cantonese as being the language of Hong Kong, you're actually cutting yourself off from even more parts of the world. The advantage of having to be both strong in English and the Chinese of China today opens up a world that is absolutely incredible, incredibly broad, more so than at any time in history. And this is an extraordinary moment when this kind of bilingualism, we didn't ask for it, we didn't create it, but it is there. And if you don't take advantage of what is there for you, and you already have that advantage, you already have enough English and enough Chinese to build on, to make yourself absolutely indispensable in a way, in kind of bilingual domination of bilingualism in the world. I think that's, you're throwing away something that is really valuable. You know, I would hate to see that happen.
Great. Well, thanks very much. But we have quite a few more questions in the pipeline, but in the interest, we have kept you beyond the scheduled time. But in the interest of time, let's make this one the last one. I'll be sure to pass on the rest to you via email. The last question comes from our colleague here at Hong Kong U, Bernadette Tsui, who says, you know Hong Kong well enough with an intimate historical perspective. What words of advice would you give to the people, or even more specifically to the University of Hong Kong?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Hong Kong U has changed so much from the time when I left 24 years ago. You see how much can change today. The rapidity of change today is something that is really quite different from what I've experienced. When I was young, things moved far more slowly, and I could always keep up with it. Today, I find it extremely difficult. The older I get, the harder it is to keep up. And keeping up with Hong Kong is extremely difficult. And it's not only Hong Kong, it's the way the world has changed. In particular, to be honest, the biggest change is China. The economic development of China in the last 20 years has been absolutely unprecedented. And it has caused ruptures everywhere, and not least to the United States. Of all people, they were the most powerful and the richest country in the world. That they themselves should be troubled by this is a reminder to us that this is something unknown, never before. So in that context, Hong Kong U has to find a place. I cannot predict what is going to happen. All I would say is this, and I come back to something that I myself is a kind of self-discovery as I grew up over time, that there's no such thing as absolute freedom. And we accept it. Every day, our lives are guided by a lot of rules and so on, some spoken, some unspoken, some written down, some followed, some accompanied by severe punishment, some are not, some are very lax. But the fact is that we live with full of rules and spoken or otherwise around us, and we live by them and we accept them. But in the midst of all that, there are freedoms to find. You can seek your freedoms, you can find little freedoms, and those little freedoms are not as little as you think. There actually are a lot of freedom around if you know where to find them. But if you expect absolute freedom, if you expect that the ideals of freedom must be 100% and must or less move towards being 100%, you will always be frustrated and it will never come. It will never happen. That's one of the things I hate to say. you might say it's a limitation, but it's not a limitation by any particular person. I think it's a limitation by the very fact that we live in societies and we have to concede other people's rights, not only your own rights. You cannot just demand your own freedom for yourself. You have to recognize and respect other people's need for freedom. And out of all that, you're looking for the little freedoms that enable you to achieve what you want to achieve. And you'll be surprised how much you can find without some loud pronouncement of absolute freedom or absolute liberty and expect that someone will give it to you. It seems to me that is something that is actually a product of the Enlightenment. Is one of the things we inherited from the Enlightenment, which of course was an ideal, but as ideals go, it's almost utopian. And most ideals are utopian, frankly. And that is one of the lessons I learned in my life, that ideals are wonderful to keep you stimulated and keep you excited and so on. But in real life, nothing is absolute. And relativity, for all its faults, and one can be criticized for being a relativist and no clear principles and so on. You find that, of course, you're always subject to being criticized as such. But in reality, I would say all of us are actually relativists to a greater or lesser extent. And the sooner you accept that as a given and do everything you can to get as much of those little freedoms from wherever you can find it, and make use of those little freedoms to bring satisfaction to your career and life and work, the better.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your wonderful response to the various questions, and thank you to the audience for your enthusiastic participation. Let's conclude the Q&A session here, and I'll hand it back to you, Anfield.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Wang, and also Professor Wang, for the question and answer session. Before we officially conclude our book webinar, may I invite Professor Leung, the director of HKIHSS, to say a few words as concluding remarks.
Thank you, Anfield. On behalf of the Institute, I thank Professor Wang for sharing his fascinating personal story, so intimately intertwined with modern Chinese history and the colonial and post-colonial history of Southeast Asia, and for the very precious lessons that we can learn from his experience. I trust that everybody will agree with me that it has been a real feast for everyone today. Helen and I and the Institute would also take this opportunity to pay special homage to Margaret, Professor Wang's lifetime companion and co-author of Home is Where We Are. For those of us who have known Margaret, and there are many in the Hong Kong U community, Margaret's sharp mind, wisdom, cheerfulness, and humor will be dearly remembered for a long time to come. In the book, Home is Where We Are, if you have read it, Margaret has shown her admirable ability of making comfortable home just anywhere. Like Professor Wang has just said, he has been a very lucky man. We thank you again, Professor Wang, for spending time with us. We wish you good health and look forward to seeing you again and probably reading your next book before too long. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
On behalf of the Government and Laws Committee, I would also take this opportunity to thank HKIHSS, Professor Siu, Professor Leung, and Dr. Wang, and also the audience for your kind assistance and participation in organizing this book webinar and making this book webinar a success. Last but not least, wish you all the very best health during the pandemic.
And thank you, Andrew, for inviting me in the first place. Thank you.
I'm extremely delighted.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.